I'm Jerry Bloom. I'm in the Health and Nutrition Cluster at IDS, but I'm also part of the China Center. And I'm here really for Gu Jing, who couldn't come. I guess a couple of comments and then let's move on. I mean, really, especially when one reads a newspaper now, it becomes increasingly obvious that China and increasingly India are becoming important global players in the development scene. And in a way, that's why we have a China Center, to really understand the impact on development. But it's why it becomes increasingly important for all of us working on development to understand the thinking, and for that matter, the historical origins of countries like in India and in China about their engagement with the rest of the world. And I think that's why this is so timely. And I hope you get people reading it from that point of view. But I want to introduce Prem Podar, who told me he is returning to Sussex. He was here many years ago. He's a former professor in cultural encounters at Roskilde University, Denmark. He was an Alexander von Humboldt Senior Fellow in Berlin, is now a Senior Research Associate at the Center for World Environmental History at the University of Sussex, as well as being a Fellow at the University of Manchester. But his research is very much focused on cultural theory, post-colonial and decolonial studies, and India-China borders. And I hand over to you. You will make a presentation of some part of your book. We'll have a comment, and then please, questions and comments from all of you.
Thank you, Jerry, for the generous introduction. Can you put in the full screen, please? Yeah. So this is really a book talk, which is based on the book that just came out. And the title is different because my publishers didn't like China and India. They thought it was provocative and too sensitive. But I don't know whether that is any better through China-India border. I think that's actually more problematic, but never mind that. So just a few words about in and what does in mean, because I'm drawing theoretically from the work of Heidegger and Derrida, who talk about presencing, which also implies absencing in a sense, right? So China is in India, and you'll know why China was in India historically, because I do a political history, and how it is present and absent everywhere. So I have those lines from Harry Clifton's wonderful poem, After Mao, where he says that country is everywhere. And he's talking about different aspects of contemporary China. So lest you think that my narrative today, my analysis today is Eurocentric, I just want to flag up the point that I'm also talking about Sima, which I don't write in the book. Sima is an old Sanskrit Prakrit word, and now lends itself to North Indian languages, where we talk about Sima as the limit, as the border as well. But Sima in old ancient Prakrit, it also means, or it implies an insider-outsider dialectic in the borderlands. So it is about border in that sense, border, boundary, and consciousness or dialectics at the border in a sense, right? So I'm referring to that. And I'm also referring to my interest in old Buddhist philosophy, which is about the distinction between samvritti satya, which is provisional truth, and paramartha satya, which is the ultimate truth. So samvritti satya applies to the border because the border is in a flux, like in a Hegelian kind of way. It is a realm, or it is a space which hints at possibilities. So it's a liminal kind of space, right? So in a sense, my book talks about that, but not in those very cryptic theoretical terms. the book is very readable in that sense, right? So you don't have to know Hegel or ancient Buddhist philosophy to understand what the border entails for two entities, India and China. These are anxious states, nervous nations. That's what it is about, this book, yeah? Okay. Now, this bit is Kalimpong at the border. And this route goes through Tibet, erstwhile Tibet, and then lands up in Galtang, which is now renamed as Shangri-La. So this is part of what was called Chama Godao. Pronunciation, not quite right, right? Ancient tea and horse road, right? Part of what some narrate as the Silk Road, Silk Route. Some contest that and say, well, this is a different kind of road. But whatever it is not the road where silk was traded. It was a road that other things were traded. Tea and horses being, of course, key to this, right? So I'll come to that. Before I come to that, I'll progressively undress as it gets warmer, as you people, emanate some heat in my direction. So let's go on to the next slide. So the book, as you can see, has this image. What does it signify? What does it connote? Now, this photograph is from around 1951. I can't establish it truly, but I think my guess is 1951. And why is that date important? 1951 is the date when General Zhang visits Kalimpong. And General Zhang is really a bigwig in Mao's CCP then. So what's he doing in Kalimpong? And why does he come to Kalimpong? He's on his way to Tibet to meet the 14th Dalai Lama, because Dalai Lama's representatives have signed an accession with China. But the agreement of the peaceful liberation of Tibet is not valid because the Dalai Lama was absent, hasn't appended his signature to it. So he's on his way to meet Dalai Lama, His Holiness, right? And why does he have to come to Kalimpong? Because the route from any place in China, Beijing, for instance, to Lhasa was very difficult, extremely difficult. The only route was via Kalimpong. So you would have to, let's go back. You'd have to come to Kalimpong, either from Calcutta, where there was a flight to Bagdogra, or a railhead. And then from Kalimpong, you'd go up to Lhasa, right? You can come from Shanghai or Beijing to Lhasa. Now, it's of course a different story. So then General Zhang is on his way to Lhasa, and he has a stopover in Kalimpong. Why in Kalimpong? Because Kalimpong was very important. It was the center for Indo-Tibetan trade, which also meant Indo-Chinese trade, right? It was big, it was huge, right? And what happened then when General Zhang is passing by, there are thousands of Tibetans and Chinese who are living in Kalimpong who line up the streets and welcome him. And signifying that welcome is that you can have the Tiranga flying side by side with the red flag. I mean, this is unimaginable today. It would have been unimaginable after 1962. You can't. But Kalimpong had some kind of a diplomatic status. There was a Tibet trading agency. There was a China trading agency. It was full of people from all over the world during that period of time. And you could do that. But the interesting thing is that in this social media generation of ours, this image circulates. And what I find extremely interesting is that this flag has been excised from it, edited out, because Indian nationalists cannot bear the idea that the red communist flag could fly there. Also, in China, where this image circulates, this flag is taken out, even though it's Indian territory, right? So it's interesting what it says, what history says about our contemporary moment, present, right? And the photo is also very interesting because it was taken by Jampa Wozel, who used to own what was called Home Studio, right? And Jampa Wozel went to the local school called Dr. Graham's Homes, which was a school for Eurasians. And he opens a studio after having learned English there. And Jampa Wozel was also quite interesting in the sense that he was a physician who he was kind of treating the 13th Dalai Lama in Tibet, right? Before he comes to Kalimpong. And he starts working at the Chinese school. And in the 1940s, that was British India, he is treated as a spy, found out to be a spy, and he's asked to leave the country, right? That's Jampa Wozel. And this is where the studio was. And this has a personal resonance with me because it's 20 meters from where I grew up, where I was born, right? So this is 10th Mile, Kalimpong. These buildings still live. I mean, they're still there, right? I mean, this is well before my time, but I could have been one of the boys, right? If I were born in the 1950s, but I come much later. And that's why this history, in a sense, is my father's history, right? And I walked on the potholes of history in Kalimpong without knowing what had happened before. And the book is a result of that. So it's a way to map out the history from the 1920s up until 1960. That's what the book does. So what does the book do? I mean, the book does various things, and Laila has kindly read 2 or 3 chapters from it. So those ones I've left out in this little synopsis here. So Kalimpong comes about because of settlement, right? The British take over Kalimpong from the Bhutanese. The Bhutanese are taking it over from Sikkim. So it has its own interesting history. And 1904 is the time when there is a settlement report by Charles Bell, right? And before that, there were other settlement reports. And I write about that in one of the chapters. It has also to do with the Viceroy Curzon's anxiety about the frontier. So if you read his lecture, the Rhodes lecture that he gives at Oxford, it's about the anxiety that British India or British Empire suffered from, right? So it goes on writing about that. In Kalimpong, the Eastern Himalayas is also part of it, as were the Western Himalayas, right? So Tibet was a forbidden land which had to be mapped out, which had to be known, and which had to be thought of in a particular way, and the borders had to be made very, very clear, right? That was the British Indian idea. And this is the moment of still the Chen dynasty in China before the Republican period sets in. So I talk about that in the first chapter. The second chapter, which I'm not going to really talk about today, but Laila will probably talk a little bit about that. No, you don't want to. Okay. So one of the arguments running in the book is that Kalimpong becomes important because it becomes a sort of a low nodal point, you could say, where the relations between Beijing and New Delhi are actually about what is happening in Kalimpong. Why? You might want to find out, because there were Tibetan rebels there, right? So this is what China was doing in Tibet. And Tibetans who were living in Kalimpong were mounting insurgency in places like Lhasa, right? That is why Kalimpong becomes very important. This is also the period of the Bandung spirit of camaraderie, right? So there was Zhou Enlai, hobnobbing with Nehru, right? 1950s, Bandung, and friendly, but marred by the Tibet question. That's what's happening. And the Chinese CCP outlet, People's Daily, begins to produce stories about Kalimpong, right? There are lots of stories. And that's what the chapter tries to do, because it helps me talk about, why there were these changes coming in the representations of a small, insignificant town, right? Why should it happen? At that point, there were about 20, 25,000 people living in Kalimpong, right? So why should it become so emblematic? That is the kind of the crux of the book, in a sense, right? And chapter 3, I talk about the foreigner registration files in Kalimpong. There was an office, Tibetans, Chinese, and other people had to register there, much like we do now. And this becomes an issue, and it allows me to think about ideas of surveillance, ideas of identity generation by the state. So all that is there. And then I talk in the conclusion about how we cannot talk about India-China relations today in a way that can be definitive. It's indeterminate. It's indeterminate, right? So that's just the two chapters I've left out here, chapter 4 and 5 is the substance of my talk today. Does that make sense? Are you with me, everyone? Yeah? Okay. So this is what happened to that. This is Kimura, Hisao Kimura. Kimura spent a lot of time in Kalimpong. He's a Japanese spy planted there. And first he's a Mongolian shepherd as a 12-year-old, works in Mongolia. And then he morphs into a monk, a Buddhist monk, passes off as Tibetan, and maps out Tibet. So he's trained in older methods of cartography, right? So you had the prayer wheel, and they would be able to count distances depending upon how many times the prayer wheel, turned, and the steps and everything. And there were papers inside the prayer wheel which would become notebooks, right? So Kimura does that. He does that. So hailing from Tokyo into Mongolia, which was a Japanese colony, and then he, as a monk, is able to traverse the terrain of Tibet, lands up in Kalimpong, and then very quickly gets transformed into a double agent, starts working for the British intelligence. And there is a man called Tharchin Babu. Tharchin Babu, another Tibetan, he runs the Tibet Mirror Press. And it was the only place where the Tibetan newspaper was published in the world, right? So you go all the way to Tibet, it would be read elsewhere wherever there were Tibetan speakers, and there were English versions of that as well. And I, as a child, I remember walking past the press. It was still in existence, but of course, Tharchin Babu was gone. His son was there, who became a pastor as well. And Tharchin was himself a Presbyterian, and but he is really working for the British intelligence, right? And he's recruiting agents from all over, right? All kinds of things going on. And Kimura writes this. He writes about Chinese agents in Kalimpong. He writes about Tibetans who are working for the communists, and he works about anti-government Tibetan exiles. So these are the insurgents, and you have the Russians, and I mean, there were all kinds of spies in Kalimpong. Also, actually, what we call Turkish, or then they were called Ottoman Empire agents, right? So why are these people all there? Because Central Asia is still, in a sense, undergoing this reflux of the Great Game. So if you know about the Great Game, what was happening, you would know that Central Asia, including Tibet, there were areas that the French, the British, all the empires, right, were interested in, and the Russians and the Japanese as well. Of course, don't forget the Japanese, right? That's why Kimura is there in the first place. And here we have another interesting story. Gyalo Thondup still lives, hasn't died. He lives in Kalimpong, used to run the noodle factory there, right? He is Dalai Lama's elder brother, the 14th Dalai Lama's elder brother, right? And he, by some accounts, was a CIA agent, even though he was speaking for Tibet, right? Speaking for the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamsala, right? So Gyalo Thondup is also one of those kind of diplomat spies, right? That Kalimpong hosted and still hosts in a sense, right? Interesting book to read if you have the time. Noodle Maker of Kalimpong. Okay, so I have two quotes from two scholars. One is Liu. Liu writes about special intelligence agents teaching inside Tibet and how they were sent to Kalimpong. And Liu's work is interesting because he is one of the few scholars, very few scholars, Chinese, who has access to Chinese archives. And I have very limited access to Chinese archives, right? So I've used whatever I could get, right? And you can read it. I won't read that out to you. And here we have a Swedish historian, an expert in cultural history, Mao and all that, writing about Tibet and writing about Mao's secret agents as well in this book. So Schoenhals is well known for launching a new way of doing history, because during the Cultural Revolution, of course, you couldn't, access many documents, but people were throwing out a lot of documents. So he had people collecting those documents which were mint, right? And his name is associated as one of the founders of garbology. Garbology is the study of history through what is thrown out, right? And spies have been well known. You must have seen movies where, people go and ferret people's rubbish, and you can find a lot about people living in the houses, right? So it is also useful in the realm of academia. That's what I think Schoenhals demonstrates. And he writes about that. And he mentions Kalimpong and Beijing and Lhasa and what is going on. So this bit is more central to what I do, which is really about Nehru and Zhou Enlai and Mao during that period. So we have Nehru, who talks about strategic towns, and he kind of aligns them with places like Riga and other border zones, including Berlin, of course, right? Where, because of the boundaries between the East and the West, that's the Cold War period, you have border towns gaining significance because they become the interface for all kinds of traffic, right? And Nehru is also very anxious about Kalimpong. His intelligence is that Kalimpong is a trouble spot, and Zhou Enlai picks it up, and he also begins to recycle Kalimpong as a nest of spies, as a command center, right? So you have the Chinese as well as the Indian cabinet, Indian leader, Nehru, really, not Patel, mind you. There were differences, so there are differences. And you have Mao, even Mao features, and Mao is not happy that the Dalai Lama wants to go on a pilgrimage, to India. And he wants to go via Kalimpong because Kalimpong is a hotbed. There are lots of Tibetans there as well, right? It's very significant for him that he stops over, right? And that's where his brother is parked as well, already, right? And this is, for those of you who don't know, this is a period when you have still the Kuomintang, which has formed a government in Tibet under Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek has lost the civil war, and he goes and finds Taiwan, right? And you know the complicated relationship between mainland China and Taiwan as well, right? Tsinghua School. This is very important if you want to talk about Chinese in Kalimpong. And if you want to talk about the Chinese diaspora in India, you have to talk about the Chinese schools, which were set up so that Chinese children living away from the homeland could be tutored into a certain kind of value system, right? So you have Ma Juchai, about whom I will talk at length now. And you have this old photograph, grainy photograph, about the Tsinghua School in Kalimpong, right? I want to talk just a little bit about Shen Fumin. Shen Fumin is sent to Kalimpong, and he arrives with a passport which does not specify that he's going to be in Kalimpong as the headmaster, right? He is clearly a spy working for the Mongolian Trade Commission, right? MTAC. And he has views that are, of course, anti-imperialistic. And he joins the Tsinghua School, becomes the headmaster, right? And he does a lot of pedagogical work in the school. He publishes Chinese readers, and he's under the surveillance of the British intelligence agency right from the beginning. And he is treated as if he were an intelligence agent, which I think the archives reveal, my reading of the archives reveal that he was in some ways, right? He also has to leave the school. There is a problem there. And he works in Bombay. He works on this film called Dr. Courtney's Ki Amar Kahani. And that film is interesting because those of you who know about Chinese history, you know about Dr. Courtney's and other medical doctors who went to China when the Chinese were fighting the Japanese. So any medical knowledge was welcome. And because of the good relations between India and China, these people like Dr. Kotnis could go there. And he is celebrated as a hero to this day. So every Chinese leader who comes, visits India, goes and visits Dr. Kotnis's family, even today, right? So Xi Jinping has gone there as well. So Dr. Kotnis is not a non-entity, yeah, for the Chinese, right? He is celebrated as a hero, right? He marries a Chinese woman, has a daughter or son, I forget, whatever, never mind that. So Shen Fumin, what is interesting about him? He leaves Zhonghua in 1955. In the 1960s, late 1960s, he joins a school run by Swiss Jesuits, St. Augustine School, right? He arrives there. And in the late 70s, when I'm at the school, he is my art teacher. So I know him. I know him. He was a tall man, always wore black sunglasses, never saw his eyes, and he came with a big Chinese flask with endless supply of tea. Yeah, he had this very stern Confucian exterior. He was a disciplinarian, spoke very little English, right? But he was a master watercolorist. Like in 2 minutes, he could paint a scene straight out of China. Yeah, if you've seen watercolors of paintings from China, you'll see that, that's what he was, Dr. We used to call him Mr. Shen, Mr. Sen. So there was no H, it was not Shun, because we couldn't pronounce Shun then. But now I think with his characters, you would say Shen Fu Men, right? So I'm now leaving the espionage bit out, and now we'll go to another character, Ma Chai. Ma Chai is this man on the horse. And I will talk a little bit about history as it has to be remembered, Wensi Jilia, and how this town Galtang becomes Shangri-La, and how he, being a nationalist, Kuomintang man, becomes a communist. And then he's narrated as a spy, caught and imprisoned. And then I make the argument that, he is not really a patriot or a nationalist. He is something more than that. And I'll talk a little bit about that, yeah? And what are my sources? My sources I'll talk about. So there are two Ma's, right? Historically, I think. One is the Ma who's rendered in the memorial that was brought out by Chinese people who knew him, also some historians. And there is also the Ancient Tea and Horse Road Museum in Shangri-La, which is Galtang, right? Or Zhongdian. Galtang is the Tibetan word, Zhongdian is the Chinese word, Mandarin word, and today it's Shangri-La because there's a lamassery and it draws from James Hilton's Lost Horizons. And of course, it is rendered as this mythical place where people don't get old and people, it's a utopian space, right? But it's become a tourist destination. It's been manufactured as a tourist destination. It's around 3,200 meters, so you get altitude sickness when you go there. And I did go there, and even though I'm a mountain man, I did feel the altitude, definitely, yeah? So my argument today is that, we have to stay away from the intelligence reports, the intelligence archives, and the patriotic, nationalistic narratives of him. He is much more than that. He's transcultural, and my argument is that he actually inhabits the inside-outside consciousness, subjectivities of people in the borderlands, right? So he really embodies that idea of the liminal sima, the border, which gives a different sense of, you're belonging to a particular nation state or only one nation state, right? That's the argument. So Ma Chai, he becomes a very celebrated figure because there is a murder in the center of town, and he is nabbed as the master spy chief who arranged this murder, as it were, right? And it's the period when, we have the liberation of Tibet, so-called liberation of Tibet or takeover of Tibet, 1959, finally, but it has been going on since the 1955s, you would say. And you have Ma, who becomes a tycoon in today's term. He becomes extremely rich, right? He has about, I don't know how many caravans he has, but this Indo-Tibetan trade that flourishes in Kalimpong is through these caravan businesses, and most of them are in Kalimpong, right? There are 2 or 3 in Calcutta, they're registered in Calcutta, but the work is in Kalimpong, right? So when I tell Ma's story, what you get from the sources is that, from the Chinese sources, it is that of a patriot, that of a nationalist, that of a hero, right? But the IB, Intelligence Bureau reports of him, makes him just into a spy, right? So if we think about Chinese historiography, which was a kind of social history that emerged under the influence of Zhou Enlai, and it was about, not forgetting the revolution, that, all the stories, the narratives of the heroes needs to be inscribed, right? All the revolutionaries who have memories of that need to be recorded, right? That's Wencesilio, cultural and historical records, right? And of course, you would be thinking, this is no social history in the manner of Eric Hobsbawm or Christopher Hill or one of those figures that you had here, British School of Social History. It has a lot of similarities. And of course, your reading would be that it's just propagandistic. It's the Chinese state egging and patronizing this kind of narrative so that you get a sense of, how glorious the revolution was, what were the different heroes who, fueled the revolution, all that kind of stuff. But I think there is another element to it. We can also read along the grain, and we can read against the grain, like Laura Stoller does. There's a different way in which because the archives run like a river, right? Whether it's Brahmaputra, the Ganges, or the Huanghe in China, they carry eddies of interest and eddies of all kinds of manner of things. So it is quite interesting for the scholar to read narratives, but read them very critically, different ways, right? So historiography, where you can get imperial historiography, imperial accounts, we can read it differently nowadays, right? We're trained to do that. And we can also read nationalist historiography in a very different sort of way. And Vinita is here taking notes, and she's going to correct me in a moment. So this is a picture I took of Shangri-La town, Shangri-La, high in the mountains on the Chinese side, right? And why do I find it interesting? Because it is in consonance with the part of 10th mile that I grew up in, where the 10th mile area of Kalimpong looked a bit like this, right? At one point. So there is a twin city effect going on, right? And we have Ma growing up in Shangri-La, Zhongdian, and he joining the Tibetan Indian wool trade, because there was yak wool that came down from Tibet, right? And what went up, you might want to ask. Piece goods, cloth, cotton, Parker fountain pens, Rolex watches, disassembled cars, automobiles, right? Because Tibet and China, they were not industrialized in this way. Now China, of course, supplies all that stuff to the rest of the world. But at one point, it was European goods, Indian goods that went up to China and Tibet, right? That's what we were talking about, 1940s, 1950s. And how does this trade route come about? So Curzon's anxiety, frontier anxiety, and Colonel Francis Young husband, who leads an expedition to Lhasa, to Tibet, which is not really an expedition, it was an invasion. About 3,000 people were just mowed down. Tibetans were mowed down, right? This would be human rights abuse today, it used to be genocide, right? But we didn't have those instruments then, right? So young husband who goes from Kalimpong, right, armed with a lot of soldiers from the British Army, who are Gorkha soldiers mainly, Gorkha soldiers, Pathans as well. And it's after that that okay, I'll finish up quite quickly. So it's after that you get the status of Kalimpong as becoming the harbor of Tibet, right? The trade route is opened. And of course, there are missionaries also waiting to save souls. That's another issue that we could go into, maybe leave it for the Q&A, right? So there's a long history of how he upscales his business, and Southeast Asia is involved when the Chinese closed down some of the Japanese closed down some of the routes during the Second World War. So we have another transformation of Ma Chai when he becomes what you call a sort of an intellectual and begins to use a particular language where he is telling his diasporic overseas countrymen that they must all become patriotic, right? So his identity as a Wachiao becomes very, very significant at that point, right? So there's a transformation from nationalist to communist, and then also becoming a kind of a spokesperson, right? He's not just happy with, supplying fighter planes to the Chinese Air Force, which is what he did. He was so rich that he could, just say, okay, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 fighter jets, right? That's what we are talking about. That's the scale. And today's Ambanis and Adnanis, will they be able to supply Rafales to the Indian Air Force? Think about it. So he is nabbed as a spy in Kalimpong, imprisoned, right? And then it becomes an international incident, and Zhou Enlai and all the CCP dignitaries are very worried, and they extract him, that would be the word, out of Kalimpong. And the Indian government is breathed down, and he's basically a jailed person. He's taken away and flown to Kunming via Rangoon, right? That was the route. And we have Zhou Enlai on record saying that we must find a good place for patriot, good old Ma Chai. And this is an argument I make in the book that, he cannot be just brought down, reduced to intelligence dossier account of him, nor can he be just reduced to the memorial or the ancient tea and horse road museum narrative of him as a hero, as a patriot. He is much more than that, right? He is a sort of a culture broker. He's very multicultural. He has become multicultural after 42 years of living in Kalimpong, has a smattering of Hindi, Nepali, and English as well, right? This is like a 10-year-old uneducated boy from Longdian, right? Who has transformed himself into an intellectual. So this is a photograph of the ancient tea and horse road, Chama Gopal Museum in Shangri-La photograph that I took, yeah, which inscribes his identity as a Wachia, right? Overseas Chinese patriot. And his patriotism, or that's the Chinese word, I won't even pronounce it, love of countryism. And he is narrated as saying, my ghost will fly to Beijing and complain in front of Chairman Mao, because he is not very happy about his treatment during the last 5 years of his life in Kalimpong, where he's imprisoned. This is another photograph of the museum. And what is interesting are these mules, right, that ferried material between Shangri-La and Kalimpong via Lhasa, right? That's how goods were carried and disassembled cars were carried. So I think I will stop here because I know this is a lot here. And I hope some of you will pick up on some of the issues that I've raised, right? I mean, I could go on and on, but we end there. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You have some comments, Steve.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Comments. So let me get this on first. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, congratulations
Thank you.
on this book.
Pleasure.
Amazing. We should give him a big hand, actually. It's a big, quite a journey. I also need to say upfront, I'm not an expert on China and India. I'm not an expert on the Northeast. I'm not an expert on this topic. So anyway, but thank you to the organizers, Maddie and Jing. You asked me to say a few words, and it also gave me a good excuse to read this, a few chapters. I haven't read it all. And that was really a pleasure. So it's really superbly written and very engaging. And, you know, there's a lot of personal motivation behind it too, which is pretty amazing. And we heard a little about it, you know, growing up there and then going back to do the academic study. So I think it would be nice if you also told the audience a little about the collaboration with your co-author, and also, you know, how the book came about, the research around it, because I think that would be really interesting. Also navigating the language, the archives, etc. So just a little bit about that, I think would be very interesting. I thought I knew nothing about the area, but actually many of you in the room, like me, probably read the book by Kiran Desai, Inheritance of Loss. Have you read it? Any of you read it? Yeah, and it won the Booker Prize. And I dug it out from my shelf. I read it many, many years ago, and it really captures, I mean, I think you should write a novel on Kalimpong, but she wrote one about 20 years ago. And what she kind of wrote about is pretty much what you capture. About here is where India blurred into Bhutan and Sikkim, and the army did pull-ups and push-ups, like maintaining the tanks with khaki paint in case the Chinese grew hungry for more territory than Tibet. And it's always been a messy map. So I think this thing about a messy map is what the book really highlights beautifully. And also you talk in the book a lot about the bartering, the trading, the warring, the spies, the different people in and out, you know, and then it's all between Nepal. You don't say much about Nepal, but actually the majority of the population in this town is Nepali. And that was this big thing that Kiran Desai's book was about. England, Tibet, Sikkim, Bhutan. So Darjeeling stolen from here. So in a way, what she writes is, Kalimpong is plucked from there despite the mischarging down like a dragon, dissolving, undoing, making ridiculous the drawing of borders. So your book is very much about this making and unmaking the different nations, etc. And, you know, your book, the chapters I read, you really beautifully highlight these anxieties, the tensions, the spies, the gateway to Tibet, also the refuge for Chinese. So you have all this happening in this town, and you look at the dynamic relationship. Now, I think maybe you could talk a little about these concepts that you introduce very early on in the book, which is the interface. Maybe you can talk a little about that. Like you refer to them as mysterious interactions that mediate between two realities. So I think that's what the book is about, but maybe you could tell us a little about that. And also talk a little about the Zomi concept, Wilhelm van Schendel, the borderlands. I mean, if you introduce it, but you don't, I'm not sure whether you actually pick it up more. And maybe you could tell us a little about that, because this is this kind of neglected space by mainstream academia. So can you tell us more about these concepts and also how they can be used in future scholarship? You talk in the talk here and also in the book about this sort of zomic resistance of state control. So, you know, how you have all these different groups coming in there. It's resistance, it's Tibetan resistance, it's the spies. And in a way, Kalimpong pays the price, right, for this being part of a pawn in this great game, so to speak, of these imperial powers that are actually, as you say, anxious and a bit insecure, India and China. And I think that's carrying on today. And then you have Tibet thrown in. So I guess, in a way, it's also a story of colonialism and occupation and genocide. And you mentioned that. But we don't hear anything about Tibet now. I mean, you know, when I was a teenager, there was a lot more on Tibet, like but now nothing. So I think if you could talk a little about that too, you know, there's this erasure almost in terms of talking about these violations. And I think somewhere in your book, you wrote that it's very difficult to get people in India and China to rationalize about these dark sides of history in terms of colonialism and all that. So I think it would be interesting to talk about that. Now, the borders, obviously borders, borderlands. I did my PhD in a border area in Western India. And these are these so-called remote areas. But actually, as your book highlights, they're not that remote, right? They're the center in a way, but we see them as remote if you take a very sort of nationalistic view. But actually, they're centers of trade, people, armies, refugees, production. And in a way, you know, you really focus on these borders. And you mentioned earlier, they're liminal spaces. They've got this insider-outsider tension and dialectic. So maybe tell us a little more about borders, scholarship on borders, borderland. You talk about metonym. You didn't, I mean, maybe we can expand on that. I didn't quite get what that meant. I read the chapters very quickly amidst a lot of marking and evaluation of proposals. So it was in a way great. I think the last thing I want to talk about is about, you know, the future of these two great powers, these anxious powers, China and India, and China and India. Actually, before that, you know, people don't really realize that there's a long history of China and India and Chinese Indians. So we have a very vibrant Chinatown in Calcutta, for example. But I guess they're slightly different from your Kalimpong Chinese. So maybe you could talk a little about the differences. In Bombay also, there are Chinese Indians. And of course, Calcutta is the center. And they went through this brutal history that you describe in the book. They were very integrated, but then, you know, they were interned in 1962. You know, that was pretty brutal. If you're a citizen of a country and then suddenly you're sent to Rajasthan. So I guess tell us a little about Chinese Indians and the relationship and the future of this. And in the book also, you outline this changing relationship, which I didn't know much about, which I should know more about. Of course, I remember slightly as a child, but you know, this idea where we're brothers, Hindi, Chini, Bhai, we're all brothers, to now this very antagonistic kind of relationship. And in a way, if you look at the shared history, it's very ironic. And so I think where I want to conclude now is with the orange madman in America and with Trumpism, and which is not really isolationist, but is actually tremendous aggression, making the world really unsafer, unhealthier too. What can China and India do about this? And in a way, you do have Asia, and Asia, you know, you can have a strong force and a strong voice. that can really provide some strong alternatives in this, which what we want is a more multilateral and multipolar world. But anyway, thank you very much for the book and for the opportunity. Yeah.
There's not so much time. Let's take a little time if people have questions or comments. And introduce yourself.
Okay.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I can see you're very nice, you're very nice storyteller. So I really second Laila's suggestion that maybe you should write a novel based in Kalimpong as well. And definitely want to. I haven't read your book, but after hearing your talk, I plan to go back to go to it and read it more carefully. What I wanted to ask you was that your book and your presentation seems to be about the messiness of national boundaries and national identities. In an era of increasing nationalism in India and China and also globally elsewhere, how do you talk about this messiness of national identities? Do you face a pushback when speaking about these things in India and China or in other places such as in the UK? Or do you think maybe this is how it needs to be because of the increasing national? Maybe that's something you also, I read the blurb of this talk, and your next book is going to be about the politics of passport.
Yes.
Is that a theme you want to draw upon as well? So anyways, just if you could have some reflections on those points. Thank you.
Thank you.
I
I have a lot of things to respond
well, let's
to.
get it up because if other
Yeah.
people have, I will ask
Yeah.
one question that,
Just a quick question. Hi, Susan Thompson. I'm a filmmaker and associated with the Centre for World Environmental History. That was super interesting. Thank you. And I agree that it's very novelistic. My question was just, you mentioned at the beginning about the Buddhist sort of terms, or when you were theorizing about the border. I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that kind of Buddhist look at the border. That's
Okay.
yeah, I will put one comment. Almost the opposite of what Abbas said. The time you're talking about, the China's abroad was the area you're describing, but now, of course, China is engaged all over the world. And I'm wondering how much of what you're seeing about how many more liminal spaces we're actually finding, and are there lessons that are being drawn from that experience for now this broader engagement of, as you say, nervous powers, but engaged in many, China engaged in many places, and for that matter, India engaged in many places now. Okay, you want to? Yeah.
So among the many approaches you've used as a historian, I commend you for the way in which you've used the archives, but you particularly use a prosopographical approach, in terms of biography of particular individuals, prosopography. And I wondered why you found that the right way to proceed when tackling these liminal spaces through individual narratives. Yeah.
Just one last point. There is a PhD candidate at IDS, Ruyu Lin, who's online, who's doing her PhD on Arunachal Pradesh, and also is looking at some of these questions. So maybe she may have a question or something later. I just wanted to say it's a different story there in a way, because China's claiming that Arunachal is theirs, right? And it's slightly
It's southern Tibet, yeah.
Yes.
Just anyone else before we turn it back to you? Everyone, good. And again, introduce yourself.
Remember all the questions you want to write.
Well, I have limited time, so I will try to
It's partly question,
respond.
but you've also stimulated thinking. And
Yeah,
we're also
Livia,
doing
go on.
thinking. You've
Go-
stimulated.
Go ahead.
I'm Divya. Sorry, I'm Divya. I'm a lecturer here in Science Policy Research Unit. This is just more of a comment on what Nita was saying about the biographical approach, but I think I also found it really interesting, this focus on spies as these transnational or transcultural figures who are so germane to the task of making of nation states or enforcing borders. But I think it's also interesting that your next book is on passport, because I was wondering how you see this kind of methodological approach to establishing the messiness versus the literature that sort of looks at processes of codification or the making or enforcing rigidness of nation states, particularly in that sort of time period, like Radhika Mongia, for example.
Thank you.
Let's have one more comment and then you don't have to answer everything.
Yeah, sorry for adding.
I get to
more
pick
to
and
that.
choose.
Sorry, but yeah, my name's James Hamilton. I'm a PhD student in history here. Yeah, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your personal biography and your personal experience as a child. I assume from your biography you left, in your 20s or something like that. But yeah, how you feel like that, your personal experience in your youth connected you to that particular story, because obviously you've chosen amongst a load of different stories about the place, and how that particular thing about that, the espionage and those sort of things chimed with your, with your youth and the effect on your later life to bring you back to that story now.
And just one comment from online. Oh, you need the mic?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, she'll have to read out.
Thank you. I'm just going to read out the question from online, from Iris Ruyulin. She says, or they say, thank you for the interesting talk, refreshing perspective. They say, I research particularly in Manuel, more on the contemporary issues about climate change adaptation and transboundary resources. I can echo much to the transcultural character of the borderland dwellers, particularly in the case of the Chinese letters that you raised. How would you describe his relationship with the then floating state forces of two Chinas, disparity of Tibet, and emerging India? How would you explain the spying of the individuals in that time or even now? Yeah,
So,
thanks.
thank you, everyone, for listening to me, first of all, and picking up on some of the very seminal points in my talk and in my book, which you might not have read. So, no, isn't this on?
Yeah, that's on.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? You can hear me. Okay. So, lot of questions, lot of comments have come my way, and there will be limited time for me to respond unless I have another hour to give you another lecture, which incorporates all the comments and the questions. But I will try to address most of them. And if you're not satisfied, just raise your hand and ask me again. You say, I wanted to know that, and I will try to answer it, right? So I will, instead of just asking or answering one particular question, I will try to produce a narrative which answers quite a few of the issues that have been raised, if you will allow me that license. So the border issue still raises its ugly head, right? Always, right? Even though it's a liminal space in the Hegelian way or in the idea of the Sima that I narrate, which I don't do in the book. But I think the border is, in that old Sanskrit term, samvritti vidya, it's provisional truth. It's in flux. It's like Trump's famous hair, right? It is true and it's not true at the same time, right? Think about that image of the border as Trump's hair, right? So I can go on talking about the border, but if, Lala, you had a very interesting comment on that, right? I can respond to that now that I'm talking about the border, no?
Yes.
What was it? What was your?
The Zomi and then.
Okay, Zomi.
And then the postmodernist, what this means for scholarship, future scholarship, and how border is actually the center, not the.
Yeah, okay.
Not the
So So Zomia, some of you must have come across the term Zomia, which was named by Willem Schendel, the Dutch scholar, historian. He wrote a book on the Bengal borderlands first. And then he writes about Zomia as this space, which is a non-state space. So you have these regions in the world, in the Himalayas, he's very interested in the Himalayas, where you cannot classify them as belonging to one particular nation state. And these spaces are interesting because lots of things happen there without the borders. So there are spaces where borders are transgressed, right? So during the imperial times, there was no clear border, but the need for clear borders comes about in the context of India and China when the nation states want to assert themselves, control over their territory, right? But during British India times, that was not really the case. It was much more porous, right? Today's subcontinent, if you look at the Indo-Nepal Treaty of 1950, the border between Nepal and India is termed porous. So people can go in and out without much control. You don't need a passport to cross that frontier, right? Only the customs are interested in lining their pockets in case you are, interested in taking stuff that you haven't paid tax on or whatever. So that space where you have, quote unquote, indigenous people, tribes who are interacting with each other, but not in a way that is properly demarcated by social scientists, because a lot of the terms that we use in sociology and anthropology would find it difficult to actually classify some of the ways of living and the ways of knowing that you find in these regions. That's what Schendel is talking about when he talks about Zomia. And Kalimpong is more of a quasi-zomic space. How so? Because you have a bit of that zomic feel about it, but it is also incorporated within the state, within the nation state of India and before the British colonial state, right? So that is why I find that idea of the Zomia quite interesting and applicable, but also not applicable. So it is clearly a borderland area. That's one way of, looking at Kalimpong and other areas there. So Zomia allows me some purchase, but it doesn't allow too much traction. That's to make that point to Lila in that sense, right? When we're talking about that. And it's also about governmentality. So to use a Foucauldian term, the idea of development, since we're in Institute of Development Studies, the idea of development is not always accepted by all people. People don't want to be developed. They refuse to be governed, right? So that's James Scott's work, yeah? The refusal to be part of the state, even though you might get development funds, but it's also very intrusive. It's also very seen negatively in terms of the values it brings, the social, cultural values it brings, and what it can do to your idea of being, in a sense, right? So Zomia also entails that idea, right? Refusing to be governed, refusing to be developed. That's the idea. So we've done the border, we've done the Zomia, and your question about, and I will come back to you. Your question about, the nation state. Of course, the matrix of the nation is, of course, only a matrix, and it's a matrix of modernity in a sense. And it does not always do what it is meant to do. That's why in India, a multinational state that it is, multi-ethnic state, we have all these centrifugal and centripetal forces, right? Some want more freedom, some want to be incorporated closer to Delhi, and so on and so forth. But what the story tells us, at least in this book, when I'm looking at a small part of the nation, which is not even a proper nation. Because people in Kalimpong, the Bhutias and the Lepchas, they don't see themselves as Indian. A lot of people in northeastern India don't see themselves as Indian. They only see themselves as semi-Indian, quasi-Indian in a sense, right? And people also resort to racial attributes of, oh, we are chinky-eyed and flat-nosed, we're closer to Southeast Asia, or even China and Tibet. I mean, there's that thing going on. So if you read Patel's letter that he sends out in 1915, he basically says, oh, these regions like Darjeeling and Kalimpong, we cannot expect loyalty from peoples living there. So that was the central government's idea of people living in the periphery as well, right? So it's very ambivalent, it's very ambiguous, and it also, to my mode of reading, what the nation does and what the state does. So in psychoanalytical terms, it is about anxiety, it's about nervousness, it is about the narratives that the state produces, what Delhi produces in terms of loyalty, demanding loyalty, in terms of the pedagogy that is instilled amongst the citizenry as to, what does it mean to be proper Indian or proper Chinese, right? That's the idea of education in a sense, idea of educational development as well. But there is that pedagogical demand being made, but performatively, people living within a particular nation state, belonging or having a passport of a certain state, they also perform their identities in different ways. They always say, but I'm not that. I can't be fixed in that kind of way. What are you telling me? I'm Indian, but I'm different, That too is there. So there is a very complicated, not only dialectics, but trialectics and multilactics that unfolds in that scenario, in that idea of thinking about nationhood and thinking about citizenry as well, right? It's a complicated area, but I can't go into that. And Divya's question, it also, I think, morphs into that idea of, what is it that, what makes me interested in the passport? The passport as the defining document of modern identity is really about nationality. It is also about state sponsorship. But the passport as a document doesn't belong to you, even though you might have your date of birth and your photograph. It is actually government property. So it can be impounded by the country that issues you. It's not something that you own. I mean, this is again a misconception that we have a passport and it tells you who you are and it tells the immigration officer who you are. To a certain extent it does, but it's a provisional document. And if you look at all kinds of histories, you'll find that the passport has been impounded during the civil rights movement in the US, where Black musicians didn't want to join the Vietnam War. They refused to sign up. Their passports were taken away because lots of them were making a beeline to Paris and Copenhagen to play their jazz trumpets, Yeah, it was a way of, escaping the draft, as it were, right? So it raises all kinds of questions. I can't really go into that, but this is another hobby horse I have. I've published 2 papers on that, and this will become a book at some point. Give me 2 years or 3 years, right? Okay, and then I should have taken notes, right? Susan, your question about what was
Buddhist terms.
Yeah, okay. So the Buddhist terms, I use the term from Buddhist philosophy, which is Samvriti Satya, and it has not been developed, but it is, I think, very useful to think about concepts that come from elsewhere, that are not Eurocentric in a sense, right? I don't really write about that. My publishers were not happy. Me going very theoretical, they didn't want that, But I find that idea of Sima actually much more interesting when you're talking about the border. The idea that, we can think about not only the legal status of the border, the inside and the outside, but also in terms of subjectivity, in terms of consciousness that people are able to imbibe at the borderlines, right? In a sense, it's again about identity. It's like, you know, I can just cross this. I'm not Nepali, I'm not Indian, I'm this or that kind of thing. And that takes me, I don't know, I mean, you want me to elaborate further on that? Yeah, but it sort of, we can apply that elsewhere. And that takes me to another point that Laila made, which was about the Nepali dimension. I don't talk much about Nepal because it really doesn't impinge on this, right? In today's world, Nepal is a key figure and a very attractive entity, both for India and for China, because China is clearly, you know, trying to flirt with Nepal because it's in its interest to have this buffer state. And India has had a historical relationship, cultural relationship also with Tibet, and India is losing that, right, in many ways. But I think Laila's question had to do with migrants from Nepal into India, and the whole of Sikkim is now 90% Nepali origin. Darjeeling Hills, probably 90% as well. But this was not the case historically, right? This is also a result of the Indo-Nepal Treaty of 1950, where people can go and work in each other's country, right, without belonging to that particular entity of the nation or the state, right? So in the Darjeeling Hills, Sikkim is of course established because it's a separate state now, right? So the power of the Nepalis, the Nepali elites is consolidated, it's not a question, right? In the Darjeeling Hills, where there was a demand for a separate state of Gorkhaland, that is an issue that simmers, right? And it's egged on by various parties in India, including the parties that rule in Kolkata and then Delhi as well. So it is considered to be a strategic area with strategic borders with, I mean, Bhutan is obviously an India protectorate, and that's also a colonial legacy. But as far as the Indian policymakers in Delhi are concerned, it is the strategic importance of Darjeeling Hills, which disallows the formation of Gorkhaland, really. I mean, the Nepali ethno-nationalists might say that they rightfully have a claim to it being a separate state within the Union of India, right? But that is a political question which simmers on. And Desai's novel obviously goes through that in a sense, you know, in narrating the subjectivities of the people of mainly Nepalis, but also you have the Anglo-Indians and some Bengali characters who also talk for it or against it in different ways, a very layered way, which only novels can do in a sense, because you can use fantasy and you can use imagination, whereas history allows you very limited amount. The other question that came up was, why didn't I write a novel instead? I wish I had written a bestseller novel, right? That would have been, you know, it would have been better in some ways. But I'm an academic, what can I do? Maybe I'll write a novel based on the material I have. It's easy, but maybe my prose is not crisp enough. It's not crisp enough to sell it as a novel, right? I need to work on my prose. I need to style myself differently, right? To be a novelist, I think. But yeah, it has that element of it. It's very playful, and that's where I think the ambivalence and the ambiguity that a novelist enjoys is able to also narrate it in that kind of form, whereas an academic book disallows you, and then you retreat into theory and theorizing, which readers find very difficult anyway, right? Anyway, this is done, but the future will show whether I've actually become a creative writer. I mean, Laila, you did a wonderful job, insightful comments, but I should have taken notes, you know. And, but you know, maybe you can again ask me or give me some pointers as to what you want me to talk about. We have 5 minutes, I think. And okay. My own narrative. Okay. So collaboration, I forgot. So collaboration and the method. Okay. So this book is largely propelled by what the material that was available, right? So there were archives. There were archives in the British Library, in Taiwan, in Yunnan as well, and in Kolkata, which has the state archives, right? Colonial archives as well. So all that I've gone through, and so I've used the material that was available to me, right? The Chinese archives are famously shut, and especially so for foreign scholars. You can't have access. A lot of the papers are classified. But I was able to access Zhou Enlai and Mao's papers, right? They are available. They are available. Now, to go back to the question that Laila posed about the collaboration. So Lisa, who appears as a co-author in this, Lisa is a very young scholar who just finished a PhD at Heidelberg. She's a Mandarin speaker, but Swedish. And she was able to look at Mandarin sources, which I have difficulty with, right? I mean, my Mandarin is basic, non-existent, more or less, right? So Lisa was essential for looking at sources in Mandarin and giving me the translation. So even if she did not analyze the public people's daily papers in Mandarin, she was able to give me a sense of, you know, what that writing was about, and then I could analyze it and use it for this book and some other articles that we have written. So Lisa was essential to ensure that, you know, other language sources, especially Mandarin, were made accessible. And it also involved ethnography. So ethnography in Kalimpong was not really a problem. They are all English speakers or Hindi speakers and Tibetan speakers. That's not really a problem. The problem is in Yunnan, where you have people speaking Mandarin, and some of them speak Tibetan. So, and they might not have any English, right? No English. So Lisa was essential in that kind of ethnography, talking to people. So Maju Chai's grandson, we met in Shangri-La, and we were able to talk to him, right? Just to give you an example. And Shan Fumin's 2 sons and daughter live in Kalimpong. That was not a problem because they are English speakers, right? Last, right? So biography becomes important because of the sources that are available, right? What is available. I mean, the IB records, of course, they also give you a general idea about the area, about what was in play. So you can read Curzon's Rhodes lecture, which is not about biography, it is about anxiety, and I use that, right, in a sense. But you're right, absolutely right, that, you know, in Ma's story, clearly the Wensi Ziliao narratives, they are biographical, very much so. I mean, that's one chapter that relies on biographical pictures. But there are other bits in the book which go elsewhere, right, to find what else. And James, your question was about. Yeah. So So like I said, I grew up there, was born there, and saw it around me, but the mule trains had gone past, That was not what I saw. That's what my father saw. But there were resonances. So you'd have old timers talking about those days when the mules came down and, people made millions, So those kinds of narratives I was able to get. So you can talk to, say, Yalothondu today, and he will tell me a little bit about, the Tibet of yore and all that kind of thing. So it's still there in terms of oral narratives that are fast receding, obviously. And I have had the pleasure and the privilege of interfacing a little bit of that with that. If I was not able to do that, I don't think this book would have happened, right? So my own enmeshment in that space has given me a sort of enough propulsion to take it forward, in a sense, right? That is the autobiographical side of it, but I can go on and on about it.